when I get to the right thing, is style. Why do I need good style? I should make this text bigger. Style in, yes?
How do we make sure that the user only puts in one number?
How do we make sure the user only puts in one number? That's hard. We'll go into it in a bit more detail a little later on, so I won't talk about that now, but there are ways, we will look at that later when we go back to looking more in depth at scanf, printf and whatnot. So that will happen a bit later, but you'll have to hold on. Is that fine? Fantastic. I want to talk about style for a bit. Style isn't about simply making your code look pretty so that when we mark it, we can give you a good style mark. Style is about making your code, making effective code, making good code, making code that is useful. When I say code that is useful, that's not just code that does the thing you want it to do. It's code that explains on its own what it's trying to do. So if I'm reading your code, I should be able to understand the problem your code is trying to solve, and I should be able to understand the solution you have come up with to solve that problem. Your code should be useful in that it should be understandable. Anyone should be able to read it, not only yourself, but say yourself in 3 weeks when you haven't looked at the code for 3 weeks and you need to go back and figure out how you solved that problem from the week 4 lab because it could come up again in the exam and you're looking through your code and it doesn't make much sense because you had terrible style. If your code is understandable and you go back and read your code from the week 4 lab and it's completely clear to you and you understand exactly how you did that thing with those arrays, then when you're studying for your exam next week, it might be a bit easier. It's useful if, when you reach a bug in your program, you can read through your code and understand and verify in your code that each line is doing what you think it's doing. You can figure out, because this particular error happened at this point, it's very easy to figure out where in the code that relates to and where in the code that must be. It also means that if you start with small code and make it slightly bigger and add more features as you go along, it's easy to figure out where to put the code to do that stuff. So the number one rule for code is for style is consistency. Your indentation should be consistent. Your names should follow a consistent pattern. You should have consistent bracing, so on and so forth. Consistency is what makes code, the number one thing that makes code easy to read. When you're creating variables, the names of your variables are incredibly important. The names of your variables tell whoever's reading the code what that variable does for your program. Your variables should always be honest. If your variable says they hold some value, they have a name which is, say, number of guesses. They should never hold anything that isn't the number of guesses made. They should always be honest. So they shouldn't hold some completely unrelated value, like whether or not something was true. They shouldn't hold some old value that's no longer relevant if you're going to continue using that variable. And generally we give out variables noun names, so we say the number of something or someone, or we say like name or age. Or if they store some sort of condition, like whether or not something is true, we name them after that condition, like correct or empty. For functions, there's also some nice tips for naming functions. Functions generally do some work. They make some action. So their name should reflect the action that they take. They usually sound like their verb. So if I have something that's going through an array and counting the number of elements, I'd say that function would be count elements. I'm telling the computer, count elements of this array. If I have a function that takes a guess from a user, I might call it get guess from user. But it's an action. It sounds like I'm telling it to do something. The other sorts of functions we tend to see sometimes are things that test for a condition. So they should be named after the condition that they're testing for. They should sound like the question the function is trying to answer. Like, is this thing empty? How many, is this thing empty? How many things are here? So on and so forth. Booleans. I mentioned earlier that false is 0 in C. False is always 0. You don't get to choose whether or not false is 0 or 1. False is 0 because that's how it works in C. That's how it's defined. True can technically be anything else, but normally for sanity we just make it 1. So there's a few ways that you can do that. Apparently, why is this so thin? Do you know what's going on there?
Yes, but I've got no idea off the top of my head.
Oh,
There's nothing else on the slide.
there's nothing else on the slide.
Yeah,
Should there be?
header must help.
Header might help. Okay, I'm going to quickly add a header. Ignore this. This is the magic that makes the slides work. This is all going as planned. An example. So there's a few ways we could define it. So we have false as 0, you don't get a choice of 0. I like to define true as not false, because if it's not false, it's true. Other ways I've seen of doing it are you can define true to be some statement that you know will always be true, like 1 is equal to 1. And then you can store this true or false value inside of a variable. And you can use things like the not operator to invert the value of the variable or a condition. Comments are important. You should always provide function comments. So if I go and look at this code here, this, I was looking at this function and I thought this function might not be clear. It might not be super clear how this function works, what this function is going to do, what its behavior is. So our functions should each get a comment above it that tells us what that function does, what the rules for using that function are, like what values I pass in, what conditions must be true about those values, and it tells us how this function is going to respond. If it's going to display things, it might need to say this interacts with the user in some way. If it's going to return a value to us in some special manner, it should tell us how to interpret the value that it returns. If I go back to the slides, so yes, function comments describe the rules for using a function. I'm not even going to avoid inline comments. So one thing that code example did not have is inline comments. There is nowhere in this code inside of functions comments that explain a single line. We have a few functions. That we call, and those functions are somewhat self-explanatory. Reading the function name, looking at the variables that get passed in, looking at what I'm storing the return value in, those help us understand how we're interacting with those functions, and they sort of make that line explanatory. If I have conditions, I can read those conditions. I know what the variables are. I know what the comparisons are. So it's pretty straightforward for me to look at line 26 and say, well, this loop is going to continue whilst there hasn't been a correct guess made, and the number of guesses made is less than some maximum. There doesn't need to be a comment for that. And in general, if you think a line of code is not clear enough and it needs a comment to explain it, you should stop and you should think, how can I change the code to make it explain itself better? If I look at code and I see a whole bunch, I see that your function is 90% comment in the middle and there's maybe like 3 lines of code, I'm not going to be very happy, because really that code should explain itself. If there's only a few lines of code, you shouldn't have needed that many comments to sort of explain what it does. I can read C, I know C, whoever's reading your code knows C. They shouldn't need that much help. And also, on that note, each line of code should have one goal. It should be doing one thing only, and it should be very clear what that one thing is. Any questions on style? I will note that in the exam, we're not really marking for style, but if you're the sort of person that's been writing your assignments, writing your lab submissions, going back and filling in style afterwards, because you've written a whole bunch of code and you're going, no, that looks terrible, I'll probably get a poor style mark, I better go and fix it. You should probably revise the way that you write your code to begin with, because your style should be something you go back and fix. Style should be something you just have by default. You should always be writing code with good style. Your code should, every time you write a new line of code, should continue to have good style. Your text editor should never have poorly styled code in it. And the reason for that is you're always working on your code. You're always making your code bigger. You're always debugging your code. And you want it to be as easy as possible to do that. When you're in an exam, when you're trying to solve a problem and you're under a bit of stress, and you're trying to figure out where a bug is in your code, you're reading through it, and it's got terrible style, you're going to be and it's going to be really difficult to figure out how to fix that problem. If you have good style in an exam, you don't have to use tons of functions, you don't have to be absolutely perfect, but if you have reasonably good style in the exam and it's easy to understand how your code is doing, what it is doing, then fixing bugs in an exam when you're under stress, when you've got limited time, becomes a lot easier. It's always in your interest to have good style. Any questions on style before I move on to memory? Fantastic. I'll take a few minutes break at this point, just so I can regain my breath. So, I'll give us 2 minutes of break, and then I'll move on to memory.